The night they offered to walk me out of the finest restaurant in the city, I said thank you. And I meant it. I meant it because I already knew something the man holding the door open for me did not. That I would be walking back through that same door in the morning, not as an unwanted stranger in a plain coat, but as the woman who owned the walls he was so proud of, the floor he stood on, and the paycheck he'd never once imagined might depend on how he treated a nobody. My name is Delia Marsh. That night, I was 52 years old, and I had just spent more money than most people see in a lifetime to buy a restaurant called Solène. And I had come in through the front door on purpose, dressed like exactly the kind of person that a place like Solène is built to make feel small. I wanted to know who my restaurant really was when it thought no one important was watching. I found out. It broke my heart a little. And then it taught a few people a lesson none of them will ever forget. Let me tell you where I come from, because it's the whole engine of this story. I grew up in a town you've never heard of, in a house where dinner was often a question rather than a fact. My mother cleaned other people's homes, and my father fixed other people's cars. And both of them worked with a kind of dignity that I did not fully understand until I was much older. The dignity of people who are looked through every single day and refuse to let it bend their backs. When I was 19, I got my first real job, waiting tables at a diner off the highway. I know what it is to carry 4 plates up your arm. I know what it is to be spoken to like you're a vending machine that talks. I know the specific, cold feeling of a customer snapping their fingers at you. And I know the warmer, rarer feeling of one who looks you in the eye and says, "Thank you," like you're a human being. I have never forgotten either of those feelings. They live in my hands. Let me tell you about one night at that diner, because it made me who I am. And it explains everything about the woman who walked into Solène 40 years later. I was 20. It was late, near closing, and a man came in, a trucker, exhausted, in filthy work clothes, smelling of the road. A well-dressed couple at the next booth wrinkled their noses and asked to be moved, loudly, so he'd hear it. And the manager, a small, mean man named Denny, went over and told the trucker we were about to close, which was a lie. We had an hour, because he didn't want a man who looked like that lowering the tone of his sad little roadside diner. I watched that trucker stand up, tired and ashamed, and start to leave. And something in me, I was 20, I needed that job, I had rent. Something in me said no. I told Denny I'd take the table on my own time, off the clock. I sat that man down, and I brought him coffee and the meatloaf special. And he ate like he hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Because he hadn't. And when he was done, he looked at me with tears standing in his eyes, this big, road-worn man. And he said, "You're the first person who's treated me like a human being in about 2 weeks, miss. I won't forget it." He left me a $2 tip, which was all he had, and I kept that $2 bill for 30 years. I still have it. Because that was the night I learned the thing that would eventually be worth a fortune. That the way you treat the person everyone else has decided is nothing tells the entire truth about who you are. Denny is long dead, and I doubt anyone cried. The trucker I think about still. That's the arithmetic that actually matters, not the one Marcus Vane did on my coat. I built my life out of that diner. One thing led to another over 30 years. I won't bore you with the ladder of it. But I ended up a woman with enough money to do something I'd been quietly dreaming about for a long time. I decided to buy a restaurant. Not to run the kitchen, to fix a broken place and make it kind. Solène was the one. An old landmark, 40 years of prestige, gone slightly sour, coasting on a reputation it had stopped earning. The bones were beautiful. The books were a disaster. And the deal closed on a Thursday. Nobody at the restaurant knew yet. The staff would be told Saturday morning. Now, my advisors told me to do the sensible thing. Walk in on Saturday, introduce myself, review the staff files, keep the ones with good numbers, let the rest go. Clean and professional. And I told them no, because a staff file doesn't tell you the one thing I actually needed to know. A staff file tells you how fast a server turns tables and how few glasses they break. It doesn't tell you who they are at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, when a tired stranger in a cheap coat sits down alone, and there is nothing to gain from treating her well. That's the only thing I've ever really cared about in a person. Because I learned young that it's the only thing that predicts everything else. A person who is kind only when it profits them isn't kind. They're just calculating. And one day, the math will change. And so will they. I wanted to know who my restaurant was on the night the math said cruelty was free. So I decided to go be the woman the math said you could throw away and see who threw me. So on Friday night, I put on a plain wool coat, the kind my mother might have worn, left my good watch at home, took no reservation, and walked into my own restaurant to have dinner as a stranger. The man at the front was named Marcus Vane. I would learn all their names by morning, but his I learned that night from the way the other staff said it, carefully, like you'd say the name of a small dog that bites. Marcus was the maitre d', and Marcus loved Solène the way some men love an expensive car, as a thing that made him feel important. He stood at his podium in a beautiful suit, and he watched me come in out of the cold. And I watched his eyes do the arithmetic that people like Marcus do in about half a second. The coat, no jewelry, alone, no reservation. A woman who, in his ledger, added up to nothing. "Good evening," he said, in a voice that had already decided the answer. "Do you have a reservation?" "I don't, I'm afraid," I said. "I was hoping you might have a table for one." A small pause, a small, cool smile. "We're really quite full this evening." He glanced past me at a dining room that was, I could plainly see, half empty. "But let me see what I can do." What he could do, it turned out, was a table by the kitchen door. Now, if you have never eaten in a fine restaurant, let me explain what that means. Every dining room has a Siberia, the worst table in the house, the one they give to people they wish weren't there. At Solène, Siberia was a tiny two-top wedged against the wall right beside the swinging doors to the kitchen, where every server bursts through with a clatter, where the light is bad, and the air smells of the dish pit, and the door bumps your chair each time it swings. That is where Marcus Fane sat me. And as he pulled out the chair, with a little flourish, I saw the corner of his mouth move, and I understood that this was not incompetence. This was a message. It said, "I know what you are, and this is what you get." I sat down. I said, "Thank you. This is lovely." And I meant that one too, though not for the reason he thought. There was one person in that room who treated me like a human being, and I want you to remember him, because he is the reason I still believe the whole trade is worth saving. His name was Eli. He was maybe 19, a busboy, thin and quick and nervous, in the way of a kid working hard at a job that doesn't respect him. He was the one who noticed I'd been sitting there for 11 minutes without water or a menu, because Marcus had made sure of that. Made sure I understood I was being tolerated, not served. Eli came over on his own. He brought me water. He brought me warm bread and actual butter, not the cold pat they leave to punish you. He straightened the wobbling table with a folded coaster so it would stop rocking. And he looked me in the eye, really looked, the way my mother taught me to look at people. And he said, "Sorry about the wait, ma'am. It's a little loud back here. Can I get you anything while you wait for your server? Anything at all?" That's it. That's the whole kindness. It cost him nothing. It was worth everything. Because Eli, unlike Marcus, did not do the arithmetic. Eli looked at a tired woman in a plain coat and simply decided she deserved to be treated well because she was a person. And there was no one important watching to reward him for it. Or so he thought. "Thank you, Eli," I said, reading his little brass name tag. "That's very kind." He smiled, surprised anyone had used his name, and went back to work. I filed it away, in the place in my chest where I keep the thank yous and the snapped fingers, on the good side, firmly on the good side. Then the Hallorans arrived, and the evening found its cruelty. The Hallorans were regulars. I could tell by the way Marcus lit up, by the way he practically levitated to the door. "So wonderful to see you again. So wonderful." He gave them the best table in the house, front and center, and he fussed over them like visiting royalty. Mr. Halloran had the shiny, well-fed look of a man who has never once been told no. Mrs. Halloran had the sharp, bored expression of a woman who has learned to make her own entertainment out of other people's discomfort. And on her way to her throne, Mrs. Halloran saw me, saw the plain coat, the kitchen door, the woman alone in Siberia, and she smiled, not at me, but about me, the way a cat smiles at a thing smaller than itself. And she said something to her husband, and they both laughed. And she said, loudly enough to carry, "Well, standards really are slipping, aren't they? They'll let anyone in these days." Marcus laughed along. That was the part that told me everything I needed to know about the man. He laughed along. I sat by the kitchen door, with my warm bread and my cold reception. And I looked at the beautiful, sour room I now owned, and I felt two things at once. I felt the old Sting, the 19-year-old in the diner, the daughter of the woman who cleaned houses, flushing hot at being made a joke. And I felt something colder and steadier underneath it, the thing that 30 years had built. I felt patient.
And because I was patient, I did the thing I'd actually come to do. I watched.
From my terrible little table by the kitchen door, which, it turns out, is the best seat in the house for seeing the truth of a restaurant, I could see everything Marcus wanted no guest to see. Every time the doors swung open, I got a 2-second window into the real Selene. And what I saw broke my heart a little, because the real Selene was dying. The kitchen was understaffed and frantic. I watched a line cook, maybe 25, working 3 stations at once, sweat on his face, because 2 people had quit that month, and no one had replaced them. I watched an older chef, a good one, I could tell by his hands, plating beautiful food with the grim exhaustion of a man who cared about the work in a place that had stopped caring about him. I watched servers flinch every time Marcus's voice rose. This was a restaurant with real bones and real talent, being slowly hollowed out by a management that spent its energy deciding who was worthy of a good table, instead of making the food worth the trip. Every so often, a server would slip through the doors, catch my eye by accident, and give me a small, apologetic look. The look one working person gives another when they both know the boss is being cruel, and neither can say so. I collected those looks. I was building a list, though nobody in that room knew it, of who my restaurant actually was underneath Marcus Vane. The kind ones, the tired ones, the ones still trying, and the ones, like Marcus, who had decided that the point of working in a beautiful room was to make other people feel they didn't belong in it. Marcus, encouraged by his favorite guests, decided to finish the job. He came over to my table, not to serve me, he never once served me, but to move me along. "So," he said, with that cool smile, "have we decided?" I should mention the tasting menu this evening is quite extensive. A little pause on the word, a little glance at my coat. So I would understand he meant expensive, meant beyond you. Perhaps something simpler might suit tonight's plans better. "I'd like the tasting menu, actually," I said. "It sounds wonderful." His smile tightened. "Of course. Only, and I do apologize, for a table without a reservation, we'd ask to secure the card in advance. Just a formality." Which is not a formality. Which is a thing they do to no one. A thing invented on the spot, out loud, to tell me in front of the room that they did not believe I could pay. And here is where it turned from snobbery into cruelty, because the Hallorans were watching now, delighted, and cruelty loves an audience. A server, hurrying through the kitchen door, clipped a tray, and a glass of red wine went over. Not near me, 3 feet away, on the floor. But Mrs. Halloran called out gaily, "Oh, careful. I think your kitchen door guest has had a little accident," and laughed. And Marcus
who had watched the whole thing happen, who knew perfectly well I hadn't touched it. Marcus seized it. He needed a reason, and here was one, gift-wrapped. He straightened up. He raised his voice so the whole dining room could enjoy it. "Ma'am," he said, "I think perhaps this isn't the right evening for you. A table like this, a room like this, really isn't for people like you. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I'll walk you out." The room went quiet. Forks paused. The Hallorans beamed. And a 19-year-old busboy named Eli stood frozen by the wall with a tray of dirty plates, his face white, looking like he wanted to say something, and knowing exactly what saying something would cost a kid like him. I stood up, slowly. I put my napkin on the table, and I looked at Marcus Vane, and I said, quietly, "Thank you. That's very kind of you to walk me out." I meant it. God help him. I meant every word. He walked me to the door, this man, with his hand hovering at my elbow, like he was escorting a criminal. And he opened it with a little flourish, the same flourish he'd used to seat me, and the cold night air came in. And I stepped out onto the sidewalk of the restaurant I owned, and the door of Solène closed behind me. And I stood there for a moment, in the dark, and I did not cry, and I did not shake, and I thought about my mother in her wool coat, and about a girl carrying 4 plates up her arm, and about a kind boy named Eli, who was, at that very moment, back inside, learning that decency doesn't always get rewarded. Not always, but sometimes it gets rewarded more than you could ever dream. Then I went home, and I slept better than I had in weeks, because I knew exactly what I was going to do in the morning. Saturday, 10 a.m. The staff of Solène gathered in the dining room before service, the way staff do when there's news. Nervous, murmuring, chairs stacked, the beautiful room bare in the daylight. Marcus was there, in a fresh suit, holding court near the front, telling someone a story with big gestures. Eli was near the back, half hidden, looking like a kid who expected to be blamed for something. The general manager, a sharp and decent woman named Renata, who I'd been working with quietly for weeks, stood up at the front. "Thank you all for coming in early," she said. "As some of you have heard, Solène has been sold. I know that's frightening, but I promise you, the new owner cares more about this place and about all of you than anyone has in a long time. She's here. She wanted to meet you herself." Renata smiled. "Please welcome the new owner of Solène." And I walked in through the kitchen door. The same door I'd been seated beside. The same door I'd been walked out of the night before. I came through it in a good coat this time. No disguise, just context. And context, it turns out, is everything. I watched it hit them, one face at a time. The recognition rippling across the room like wind across a field. I watched it reach Marcus Vane, last of all. He went the color of the tablecloths. His mouth opened. His hand, I noticed, drifted up toward his tie, the way a man's hand does when the floor he's standing on has quietly vanished. And I watched the recognition move through the rest of them too. And it moved differently in different faces. And that told me everything. The tired older chef, standing at the back with his arms crossed, looked at me. And then a slow, astonished smile spread across his face. The smile of a man who has just realized that the woman the boss threw out last night is the woman who signs his checks now, and who saw from that terrible little table exactly how hard he'd been working in a kitchen everyone had given up on. The young line cook next to him actually laughed out loud once and clapped a hand over his mouth. The servers who'd given me those small, apologetic looks the night before were staring at me with something like hope, because they understood, before I said a single word, that the world had just turned over, and that this time it had turned in the right direction. Only Marcus and the few who'd laughed with the Hallorans looked like the ground had opened. Fear does that. It sorts a room instantly into the people who have something to be afraid of and the people who don't. I've never seen a cleaner sorting than the one that happened in Celine that morning, in the silence, before I'd even opened my mouth. I didn't scream. I want you to know that. I had every right to, and I'd had the whole night to build a fire. And I chose not to light it, because I've been on the other side of a person with power and a temper. And I know that the cruelty you answer with cruelty just teaches everyone in the room to be more afraid, not more kind. So I stood at the front of my restaurant, in the daylight, and I told them a story. Last night, I said, a woman came into this restaurant, alone, in a plain coat, no reservation. She wasn't anyone important, as far as anyone here could tell. And I want to tell you what happened to her, because it's the most important thing you'll hear from me today. The room was silent. She was seated by the kitchen door, on purpose, to make her feel unwelcome. She waited 11 minutes for a glass of water. She was mocked out loud by guests, and the man who runs this dining room laughed along instead of protecting her. And when a server spilled a drink across the room, that same man used it as an excuse to raise his voice and tell her in front of everyone that a place like this isn't for people like her. And he walked her out the front door into the cold. I let that sit. I watched Marcus Vane understand, fully now, what was happening. That woman, I said, was me. Nobody breathed. And then a strange and important thing happened. From the back of the room, one of the servers, a woman named Carla, in her 40s, who I'd seen give me one of those small, apologetic looks the night before, spoke up, her voice shaking. "I wanted to help you," she said. "Last night, I saw what he was doing, and I wanted to bring you a real menu and tell him to stop. And I didn't. Because," her voice cracked, "because I have 2 kids, and Marcus decides the schedule. And the last person who crossed him got cut to 1 shift a week until she quit. I'm so sorry. I'm so ashamed. I just needed you to know it wasn't that we didn't see you. Some of us saw you, We were just scared. And that, right there, told me the deepest truth about what was wrong with Solène. Deeper than Marcus, deeper than one cruel night. Marcus hadn't just been unkind to guests. He'd built a little kingdom of fear, where good people, kind people, people who wanted to do right, were too frightened for their livelihoods to act on their own decency. That's what a bad boss really steals. Not just the joy, the courage. He'd taught a whole staff that kindness was dangerous and silence was safe. And he'd been proven right often enough that they'd believed him. "Carla," I said, and I made sure my voice was gentle. "Thank you for telling me that. And I want everyone to hear my answer, because it's the most important thing I'll say today. Nobody in this room will ever again have to choose between their conscience and their schedule. Not here. Not while I own these walls. If you are kind to a guest, and it costs you, it will cost you nothing, because I will have your back in writing. The fear ends this morning." I looked around at all of them. "You were never the problem. The problem was a man who made your goodness expensive. I'm making it free again. I bought this restaurant 3 days ago. And last night, I came in as a stranger because I wanted to know one thing. I wanted to know how the people who work here treat a guest they think can do nothing for them. Because that, and only that, is the truth of a place. Not how you treat the Hallorans. How you treat the woman by the kitchen door." I turned to Marcus Vane. "Marcus," I said, and my voice was very calm and very quiet, and it carried all the way to the back of the room. "You have worked here a long time, and you're good at parts of this job. But last night, you looked at a person you thought was worth nothing, and you decided that gave you the right to humiliate her for sport, in front of a room, to entertain the people you thought were worth something." I paused. "I think perhaps this isn't the right place for you. A room like this really isn't for people like you. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Renata will walk you out." His own words, given back to him, gently, exactly. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't have to. The words did all the work, because they were true, and because he recognized every single one of them. He tried to speak. "Ma'am, if I'd known who you—" "That's the whole problem, Marcus," I said. "You would have treated me beautifully if you'd known who I was. You'd treat anyone beautifully if you thought they mattered. But a person's worth was never supposed to depend on whether you could see their money. My mother cleaned houses for people like the Hallorans. She was worth 10 of them. You'd have sat her by the kitchen door, too." He looked at me then, and for just a moment, I saw something real move behind the fear. Not remorse, exactly, but understanding. "You planned this," he said quietly. "You came in like that on purpose, to catch me." "No, Marcus," I said, and I meant it. "I came in like that to find out the truth. I was ready to be proven wrong. I was hoping to be. If you'd shown me 1 ounce of the kindness that boy showed me," I nodded toward Eli,
You'd be keeping your job right now and getting a raise. I didn't catch you. You had 100 chances last night to be a decent man to a tired stranger, and you spent every one of them on cruelty because you thought there was no cost. That's the only test there ever is, and you didn't fail it because I owned the building. You failed it because there was a person in front of you, and you couldn't see her until you thought she could hurt you. I let that land. That's the saddest way to live, I know. I'm not angry at you. I'm just not going to let you run my dining room. And that was all. Renata walked him to the door, the front door, with a little flourish. I noticed, though she was kinder about it than he'd been, and it closed behind him. And Marcus Vane was gone from Selene. And the cold air came in. And then the door shut, and the room was warm again. As for the Hallorans, I sent them a very polite letter on beautiful Selene stationery, informing them that their standing reservation was, regrettably, no longer available, as standards had recently changed. I understand they were quite upset. I understand they told everyone. I found I could live with that. I thought about the Hallorans a lot, actually, in the weeks after. Not with anger, with a kind of pity that surprised me. Because here's what I understood, having spent my life on both sides of that dining room. The Hallorans weren't cruel to me because they were powerful. Truly powerful, truly secure people almost never bother to humiliate a stranger. They've got nothing to prove. The Hallorans were cruel because somewhere underneath the money, they were frightened. Frightened. That they were only worth the table they sat at, the reservation they held, the deference they could command. Make a joke of the woman by the kitchen door, and for one moment you feel certain you're not her. That's all it ever is. That's all it was in my diner 40 years ago, and all it was at Selene. Cruelty is a frightened person renting a feeling of safety, and the rent is always somebody else's dignity. Once I understood that, I couldn't quite hate them. I just didn't want them in my restaurant, teaching my staff to be afraid ever again. Now, Eli. I called him up to the front, this nervous 19-year-old who'd brought a stranger. Warm bread when there was nothing in it for him. He came up looking like he thought he was in trouble, and I watched him brace for it, and I remembered bracing exactly like that. A long time ago, in a diner off the highway. Eli, I said, last night, you were the only person in this building who treated me like a human being. You brought me water. You fixed my table. You used a kind voice with a woman you thought was nobody, when it could only cost you and never help you. I felt my own throat go tight, which surprised me. That's the only thing I actually can't teach. Everything else in a restaurant, I can train. That, you either have or you don't. And you have it. I learned Eli's story later, once he could speak to me without shaking. He'd taken the busboy job at 16 to help his mother, who was sick, and he'd stayed through her illness and past her death, working nights, sending money home to a younger sister. Marcus had passed him over for every promotion. Had once told him he didn't have the right look for the floor, which is the polite language cruelty uses when it means something uglier.
Eli had kept being kind anyway, to every guest, for 3 years, in a building that had never once been kind to him.
That's the part that undoes me, even now. The kindness wasn't a strategy. It couldn't have been. There was nothing in it for him, and never had been. It was just who he was, in the dark, when it cost him and helped him nothing. I made him a manager, on the spot, in front of everyone. A 19-year-old busboy, promoted over the heads of people twice his age, because when he thought no one important was watching, he chose to be kind. He cried, a little. I pretended not to notice, the way you do for someone whose dignity you want to protect. He runs a good chunk of Selene now, years later. He's extraordinary at it. And he treats every single person who walks through that door, the ones in the good coats and the ones in the plain ones, like they might just own the place. Because at Selene, that's the only rule that matters now. I had it printed and framed and hung in the kitchen, where the staff can see it every night before service. It says, treat everyone as if they own the room. You never know when they do. I kept the tired old chef, too. His name was Gerard. And the first thing I did was hire him the 2 cooks he'd been begging Marcus for, and give him a raise that made him sit down. He wept in the walk-in cooler, where he thought no one could see. A server told me later. Within a year, Gerard was cooking the best food of his life, because it turns out that talent doesn't die in a hollowed-out kitchen. It just goes quiet and waits for someone to care again. The young line cook who'd been working 3 stations became his sous chef. The servers stopped flinching. Selene got its 2nd star back, the one it had lost during the sour years. And the food writers who came to see why all wrote about the extraordinary warmth of the room. And none of them ever knew that the warmth was just the simple absence of Marcus Vane and the simple presence of people who'd been shown, for once, that decency gets rewarded. I go in most nights, still, and I sit, sometimes on purpose, at that tiny table by the kitchen door, the worst table in the house, the one Marcus meant as a punishment. I've come to love it. It's still the best seat for seeing the truth of the place. And what I see now, through those swinging doors, is a kitchen full of people who like each other, doing beautiful work for anyone who walks in any kind of coat. Eli, by the way, still keeps the framed rule polished. He's the one who reads it to every new hire on their first night. The busboy who got thrown a lifeline, reading the rule to the next generation, telling them the story of the woman in the plain coat and the night that decided everything. He always ends it the same way. He tells them, you never know who's sitting at the worst table in the house. But that's not really why you're kind to them. You're kind to them because that table has a person at it. The rest is just what happens after. He learned that at 19, with a basket of warm bread, when he thought no one important was watching. He turned out to be the most important one in the room. He usually is. The kind ones usually are, in the end. It just takes the world an embarrassingly long time to notice. The night they offered to walk me out of the finest restaurant in the city, I said thank you, and I meant it. Because I already knew I'd be walking back through that door in the morning. But I'll tell you the thing I didn't know. The thing that surprised even me. I thought I was coming back for revenge. And when the morning came, and I stood in my own dining room and gave Marcus Vane his own words back, I didn't feel the sweetness I'd expected. I felt tired and a little sad for the small, frightened man who'd needed to make a stranger feel worthless in order to feel like somebody. What I felt instead, what filled me all the way up, was making Eli a manager. Watching a kind kid get lifted for the exact thing the world usually punishes you for, that's the part I'd do again, 1,000 times. So here's what that whole night left me with. And I'll hand it to you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening. Be kind to the woman by the kitchen door, not because she might own the building, because you never needed a reason in the first place.